Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to see such a full house this evening here in the Rothenburg Hall on the occasion of the fifth lecture in Tudor Studies in honour of our former curator of British historical manuscripts, Mary Robertson. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here. I look after the fellowship programme, the conference programme and the lecture programme. It's my genuine pleasure to introduce to you this evening both our honoree and our speaker. Over a career lasting several decades at the Huntington, Mary Robertson stewarded our extraordinary collections in medieval and early modern British history, animating and mobilising them in the service of scholars from all over the world, especially from the United Kingdom, who needed to be at the Huntington to work on those magically entitled archives, Ellesmere, Hastings and Stowe. On the occasion of her retirement, I engaged in a primitive digital humanities project. I did a Google Books search on "Thank You, Mary Robertson, Huntington Library," and it turned out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acknowledgements from scholars from all over the world who wanted to say thank you to Mary for everything that she'd done in the service of early modern British history. Please join me in paying tribute to Mary Robertson. On the occasion of that retirement, Mary's friends and several Huntington donors got together and created an endowment which makes it possible to bring to the Huntington for a short period every year a leading scholar whose interests must be in 16th century British history. And past fellows and lecturers have included Felicity Heal, Susan Brigden, Greg Walker, and last year, Alexandra Walsham. It's my great privilege this evening to introduce an old friend and colleague, Diarmaid MacCulloch, who is the Emeritus Professor of the History of the Church at the University of Oxford, where he's taught since 1997 till his retirement last year. Diarmaid holds his first degree and his PhD from the University of Cambridge. He's a Fellow of the British Academy, a position to which he was elected in 2001. He was knighted in the 2012 New Year's Honours for services to scholarship. I could give a very long and fulsome introduction to the bibliography of the works that he's published, but let me pick out a number of the highlights. Suffolk and the Tudors, Politics and Religion in an English County, 1500 to 1600, which won the Whitfield Prize of the Royal Historical Society in 1986. Thomas Cranmer, A Life, published in 96, which won the Whitbread Biography Prize, the Duff Cooper Prize, and the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. Tudor Church Militant, Edward VI and the Protestant Reformation. Reformation, Europe's House Divided, 1490 to 1700, which won the Wolfson History Prize, the British Academy Prize, and the Non-Fiction Award from the National Book Critics Circle of the USA. A History of Christianity, published in 2009, the first 3,000 years, which won the Hessel-Tiltman Prize and the Cundall History Prize. Most recently, of course, he's renowned as the biographer, a biography that was supposedly impossible to write, of Thomas Cromwell, published in England in 2008 and with a significant subtitle, Thomas Cromwell, A Revolutionary Life in the United States last year. As many of you will be aware, Diarmaid is also a significant presence in the British television media, for whom he's written and presented many shows and series, including A History of Christianity, How God Made the English, The Rise and Fall of Thomas Cromwell, and Sex and the Church. To discuss Thomas Cromwell, Getting Past the Myths, please welcome the 2020 Mary Robertson Lecturer in Tudor History, Professor Diarmaid MacCulloch.
Thank you, Steve, for that very generous introduction. I'm reminded of a dry old Scottish minister I heard who was introduced fulsomely once, who said, "After such an introduction, I can hardly wait to hear myself speak." It is nevertheless a huge pleasure to be with you and to enjoy the generous hospitality of the Huntington here today. It's particularly a pleasure for me to be the Mary Robertson Fellow this year. Mary's name was known to me over 40 years. She is a Tudor scholar in her own right, but it has been an absolute pleasure to meet her in person and to be in this place to which she has given so much over the years. But to Thomas Cromwell, this is a large audience and we have a very different set of knowledges of Thomas Cromwell among us. So let's try to begin with, to gather the conventional picture, one might say, what we actually know, what levels of knowledge we've got about Thomas Cromwell. Well, most of us here today will remember he's Tudor. He was the faithful servant of Henry VIII, or lackey of Henry VIII, if you prefer, involved in many judicial murders before being judicially murdered himself in 1540. Of course, associated with the dissolution of the monasteries. Those of us the other side of the water will remember a music hall song in London at the beginning of the 20th century sung by Miss Mary Lloyd. I'm one of the ruins that Cromwell knocked about a bit. It's not certain as to whether Miss Lloyd meant Thomas Cromwell or his collateral descendant Oliver, who both knocked ruins about a bit. But undoubtedly, Thomas Cromwell did knock ruins about, and monasteries were the subject of those ruins. Going a bit further down, we may associate the name Thomas Cromwell with another great Protestant heroine, Anne Boleyn. They're often seen as very closely associated in that turbulent 1530s. And those of us who delved a bit further as undergraduates, certainly in British universities, will in the 1970s, when I was an undergraduate, have been forced to write an essay on the Tudor Revolution in government. Hence my slightly jokey subtitle for the American edition of my biography, A Revolutionary Life. I knew it had a slightly different connotation in the USA, but there we are. So that's the sort of set of things we might know collectively in this room about Thomas Cromwell. And I'm not going to demolish them all, but I'm going to try and change them around a bit, change this conventional portrait. And to start with, here is the conventional portrait of the man by Hans Holbein, that genius who got inside people's skin, and in this case, didn't leave us a particularly flattering image. The negative image of Thomas Cromwell has quite a lot to do with this puffy-cheeked civil servant about to lose his temper. It is not a very flattering image, let's face it. And this particular picture, you may have seen if you've been to New York, because it's in the Frick, and it's in a room, one side of a fireplace, and on the other side of the fireplace is another Holbein portrait of another Tudor statesman, Thomas More by name, looking all thoughtful and noble and a bit like a martyr. The contrast is not flattering. However, there is something rather interesting about these two Holbeins in the Frick. They've been analysed extensively now, and it is quite clear that the portrait of Thomas More was extensively altered while it was being painted. As if Sir Thomas walked into the atelier of Herr Holbein and said, Herr Holbein, yes, I think I'm not sure I look noble and thoughtful enough yet. Can I be a bit more martyry, do you think? Whereas the portrait of Thomas Cromwell was not altered at all while it was being painted. Moreover, we know that that very painting in the Frick was hanging in his own parlour in the 1530s. In other words, it looks as if Thomas Cromwell looked at his image, the image you see before you, and said, "Yep, that's me, and I don't care who knows it." Rather, as famously his collateral descendant Oliver Cromwell said to Sir Peter Lely when he was painting his portrait, "It must be warts and all." Almost as if that was a Cromwell family joke. But looking at the picture made me straight away think, yes, this man is interesting. He's comfortable in his own skin, whatever that skin looks like. And the image is of King Henry's faithful servant. We may think it's grumpy. It was probably meant to look anxious, because a servant of the king should look anxious. I should have brought you another Holbein portrait of one of Thomas Cromwell's first patrons, Sir Henry Wyatt, the father of Thomas Wyatt, the poet, because he has exactly the same stance. Look, grasping the royal letter, anxious, thinking all the time of the king's will. So there are multi-images here. But there is still that thought, yes, I'm who I am. And I noticed another phenomenon of this sort in Thomas Cromwell's career. Eventually, 1536, he was made a peer of the realm, a member of the House of Lords. And he took the title at that time. The heralds gave him a title. He obviously chose it. He chose to be Baron Cromwell of Wimbledon. Now, those of us in the United Kingdom know Wimbledon for other reasons, and you may too. Tennis is played there now, but it would have had a different resonance in the early 16th century. It was a huge manor to the southwest of London, going up to the Thames. It was owned by the Archbishop of Canterbury up to 1536, when Thomas Cromwell got it from his friend Thomas Cranmer. And that's why he could be Lord Cromwell of Wimbledon. But the point about Wimbledon was that in this large, wealthy manor stretching down to the Thames was a small hamlet on the River Thames called Putney. And this was the birthplace of Thomas Cromwell. And so when he strode into the House of Lords for the first time in summer 1536, he was standing there as Baron Cromwell of Wimbledon. In other words, he was saying to the assembled, affronted noblemen of England, "I'm the boy from Putney, the son of the beer brewer in Putney, and I don't care who knows it." Once more, you see, comfortable in his own skin. I think that's interesting. It shows chutzpah. This man is more than the thug he's often been portrayed as. So that's new. Just looking at the portrait is new. Looking at something we knew and finding it new. That is the peerage title, something as run-of-the-mill as that. What else is new? Well, another thing which is new is Hilary Mantel. That extraordinary sequence of novels, which soon will be 3, a trilogy, which has, I think, revolutionized the way in which people view this man. Previously, the big literary image came from a work of genius, Robert Bolt's A Man for All Seasons, with Thomas More as the hero and Thomas Cromwell, therefore, as the anti-type, you might say. Now, Hilary has changed that. Her portrait of Thomas Cromwell is really rather similar to my Thomas Cromwell. And this is remarkable because we weren't talking together to start with. We gradually entered a warm conversation about Thomas Cromwell. But we came to this man from 2 different directions and found the same man. Many of you will have read the books. Some of you may have seen the BBC television series. I don't know how much it gets over here, but there Thomas Cromwell was portrayed by Mark Rylance, the English actor. Splendid man. And what a portrait it was. But what an enigmatic, silent portrait it was. A man who kept his own counsel throughout that superb series. I wonder how many people saw the stage version of Wolf Hall, which actually went to Broadway. Now there, a different actor played Thomas Cromwell. Ben Miles by name, superb actor. And his performance of Thomas Cromwell was utterly, utterly different from Mark Rylance. He jumped around stage. He was on stage for the whole 2 hours of the play, minus 5 minutes, an extraordinary achievement. Reacting to situations, improvising, a bundle of energy, a sort of Till Eulenspiegel of Tudor England. And so how can you get two such different portraits of the same man coming out of the same novel? On the one hand, you got Mark Rylance, on the other, Ben Miles. What a contrast. Well, you could say it's genre, couldn't you? You could say on television, the camera can pan lovingly over your face close to, and you can be enigmatic. It wouldn't look right on stage. It would look boring. And in exactly the same way, jumping around in front of a camera on telly doesn't work. So this is partly about genre, but it is also saying something about the man. There is the energy. It just bursts out of the archive, which is huge. I spent 5 years going through Thomas Cromwell's papers. They're divided between the National Archives in Kew in London and the British Library in London. The archives got split since the 17th century, but it's there, and it is his archive confiscated by Henry VIII at his death. Huge. Thousands on thousands of documents, which present you with the energy, with the jumping around stage, with the improvisation. I often thought at the end of one of my days going through the archives, and I would start about 8:30 in the morning, have a siesta at lunchtime, but I'd be there till 7. And by that 7 o'clock, I was exhausted. And I thought to myself, so must he have been. At the end of one of those days, from 8:30, whenever it might have been, till 7, how tiring it must have been to get this barrage of stuff coming in. Yes, there was the energy that he coped. He coped at least for 9 years under his master, the king. But the odd thing about that archive, and here comes the enigma, the Mark Rylance side of it, is that, yes, thousands on thousands of documents in the archive, but you realize as you go through it, there's something odd. It's entirely the incoming letters, the in tray, as us oldies might say, the inbox, as the young might think of it from email. Not the outbox, the sent mail, the out tray. It's not there. And you might say, well, okay, that's what you expect in an archive because you heap up the letters sent to you. No, that is not how a Tudor statesman would work. They would draft a letter and they'd get their clerk to do a final draft and they'd look through that and they'd say to their clerk, yeah, I'll just alter that, all right. Right, send a fair copy and file that last draft as my check in my archive. All of those virtually are missing from Thomas Cromwell's archive. So what happened? I can't tell you definitively what happened, but I would hazard that when his household in 1540 heard he'd been arrested, they sat up all night burning the out tray because they thought it's what you write to other people that incriminates you, not what they write to you. Now, it was a good try, and it didn't work. But what it has done is deprive us of his voice. That was one of the fascinations, actually, of doing the book. We've got about 300 letters of Thomas Cromwell in other people's archives and thousands of letters written to him. So what I was trying to do for a lot of the time was to get the impress of the man off other people's reactions to him, in their letters to him. It's a fascinating task, and I think I achieved quite a bit there. But I also had to do other things, to go to other sources, rather like that peerage title, rather like thinking about the portrait. But one very important piece of evidence was his heraldry. Now, heraldry is still there, I've always been fascinated by it, but it's a bit of a nerdy antiquarian thing now, isn't it, heraldry? In other words, it's not important now. In the 16th century, it was vitally important. It was the language of power. And you had to understand it as we, you and I, have to understand road signs. And exactly for the same reason, because something nasty might happen to us if we didn't understand it. So what do we understand by these two shields? On the left, you see the heraldry of Thomas Cromwell's first great master, before Henry VIII, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. And on the other side, you see the arms which Thomas Cromwell himself registered with the College of Heralds, technically matriculated, in 1532. And you will see, you hardly need me to point it out, that they're similar. Look what he's done. That top bit, which is called a chief in heraldry, has become this middle bit, which is called a fess in heraldry. But the same elements on it. The Tudor rose in the middle, symbolizing the service to the king, which the cardinal was, that was his job, and then it was Thomas Cromwell's job. Either side, those birds, black birds, but not blackbirds, but choughs, Cornish choughs they're called. And another name for them is Becket. These are Beckets. And these symbolize, therefore, anyone called Thomas, like Thomas Becket. But first Thomas Wolsey and then Thomas Cromwell. How ironic, if you know anything about Thomas Cromwell, because he actually destroyed the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1538. But he'd registered these arms 6 years before, so he didn't know. The point is that this is sending us a message. He is saying, Thomas Cromwell is saying, I'm the cardinal's man. I'm the cardinal's servant. And he was saying that, as I observed in passing just now, in 1532, 2 years after the cardinal had died in disgrace. That was a very brave thing to do. He was the coming man under the king, and it might be embarrassing to acknowledge where he'd come from. But no, he said, I'm the cardinal's man, and told a herald to put that message into his heraldry. And there would be many people around who would notice it and be very cross. Particularly the chief coming lady at court, Anne Boleyn. Not yet queen, but on her way there. She would be furious because she had hated the cardinal and she had destroyed the cardinal. If anyone had brought the cardinal down, anyone had poisoned the mind of the king against the cardinal, it was Anne Boleyn. Besides her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, would also be extremely cross because he had helped to bring the cardinal down too. So isn't that extraordinary? Thomas Cromwell, in that situation, very aggressively said, I'm the cardinal's man. The cardinal may be a non-person now, but I'm the cardinal's man. And this actually overturns one of the great assumptions about Thomas Cromwell's career, that he and Anne Boleyn were allies. They were, of course, both people of the Reformation. And so it has been natural since the 16th century to suppose that they were friends and allies and that she advanced his career. Oh, no, they weren't, and no, she did not. She held his career back all through her reign until 1536. She clearly stopped him having any major traditional office in the kingdom. And it was only after her death and execution in 1536 that Thomas Cromwell started getting those posts. Lord Privy Seal, that peerage I told you about, Lord Cromwell of Wimbledon, and a knighthood which he'd never had in her time, despite all the things that he was doing to promote her marriage because the king wanted it to the king. All the time, he never got his reward. So that changes the story rather dramatically, doesn't it? And there is a rather surprising corollary to that idea, because if there is one great lady at court called Anne Boleyn, Queen Anne Boleyn, there is another great lady at court, the Lady Mary. The Lady Mary, who was the daughter of the previous queen, Catherine of Aragon. It is quite clear, as you look at the archives with this new thought in mind, that Cromwell and Mary were allies against Anne, and that from early 1536, Cromwell was conspiring with Mary to put her back in the succession to the throne as heir presumptive to the English throne. And that is what happened as a result of the execution of Anne Boleyn. Now, Mary, with an awful struggle, because she had to say that her mother's marriage was invalid, an awful humiliation, but that humiliation led to her being heir to the throne once more. And the man who had got her there was Thomas Cromwell. Isn't that strange? Because we know, this audience knows, that this Lady Mary would go on to be Queen Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, the symbol of Roman Catholicism in England, in the English Reformation story. And yet, actually, she's a late teenager in 1536. She's not who she would be. She is the friend of Thomas Cromwell. She owes so much to Thomas Cromwell and went on doing so. She was back. And that friendship and alliance went on into the next marriage, that of Queen Jane Seymour. The Lady Mary was at court, honoured, successful now, with a future in front of her, and with Thomas Cromwell at her side. So much so that in 1537, on 14th of February 1537, there is an entry in Thomas Cromwell's personal accounts for 20 golden crowns to send to my Lady Mary, that she should be my Lord's Valentine. The Lady Mary was Thomas Cromwell's Valentine on the 14th of February 1537. There's a thought. That dumpy widower being the Valentine of this late teenager. Well, it was a sort of uncle-niece relationship, I guess. But she went on in the next year to be godmother to his first grandson. So this was a relationship with a future. And who knows where it might have gone if he had not been executed. People did say they're going to get married. And the imperial ambassador reported this to his master, Charles V. People say that Thomas Cromwell is going to get married to Lady Mary. And the ambassador, who was not a fool, said, that's not going to happen. He's not that stupid. And I think Thomas Cromwell also would have thought that. But it's interesting that people were saying it. And then it just got written out of the Tudor story because things went in such a different direction. All this is strange. He's beginning to look strange and unexpected. And let's step back to his early career, which is really strange. He entered public life as the cardinal's servant, in 1524, by which time he may have been 40, 39, 40, something like that. We don't quite know when he was born. And that's about the time that many Tudor men are dying. This man is starting his career out of total obscurity. Jobbing lawyer in London, bit of money lending, involvement in the cloth trade, that sort of thing. And then suddenly, he's in the service of the greatest man in the realm after the king, Cardinal Wolsey. Why? What happened? Why did Wolsey pick him out of any of the other jobbing lawyers around London at the time? Because if one goes further back in Thomas Cromwell's career, the weirdness continues and explains this, because when he was a teenager, he left Putney, as many imaginative teenagers must have done at the time. Putney, place on the one-horse town up the River Thames. But the usual unimaginative teenager would have just gone downstream to London, 4 miles, 5 miles or so. No, he didn't. He went to Italy. He went to Florence, one of the greatest cities in the world, instead of provincial, marginal England. Florence, Italy, the center of things. He spent time in Florence, he spent time in Venice, probably many other cities as well, in his late teens. And there he met a young man who was one of the great mercantile families of Florence, the Frescobaldi. And the Frescobaldi were a firm trading with Northern Europe. They exported wine to Northern Europe. They've been doing it since the 13th century, and particularly England. They are still exporting wine, actually, the Frescobaldi, in Florence at the present day. And from England and Germany and Danzig and places in the north, they would bring back cloth to Italy and anything the north had to offer. It's a great international trade. And however, for some reason, Thomas Cromwell charmed his way in to this great international mercantile business and learned his trade with them all over Europe, in Antwerp in particular, the great center of cloth trade between North and South Europe. But he spent so many years in Italy as a late teenager. He came back mysteriously well-educated, never went to university. We know nothing about his schooling in England, but he came back knowing not just French and German, spoke those reasonably well, a bit of Spanish, Latin, the language you really need in sophisticated political circles, but also, of course, Italian. He came back to England sometime in the late teens, 1520s, as the best Italian in all Tudor England. And that is what Wolsey wanted. Why? Because in 1524, Cardinal Wolsey turned his thoughts to his future, not in this life, but in the next. And what do you do as a cardinal at the time with those thoughts? You build your own tomb. And you also employ lots of priests to pray for your soul. But at the center must be this tomb. And it being Cardinal Wolsey, it must be the best tomb anywhere in England. And that means outclassing the previous contender for best tomb, that of King Henry VII. Some of you may have seen King Henry VII's tomb. It still exists in Westminster Abbey. And it is the most splendid and marvelous piece of Italian craftsmanship. And so Wolsey's tomb, too, must be Italian. He got the best sculptors around. Torrigiano, who'd made the Henry VII's tomb, had gone. But he had enough Florentines now to do his tomb, Benedetto de Rovezzano this time. And so Cromwell's job, the center of Thomas Cromwell's job in this Cardinal's legacy project, was to talk to Rovezzano and his Italian craftsmen. You can picture the scene. The cardinal has a restless night and broods about the sculpture on the tomb and thinks, I don't like that nose, I don't like it. So he sends off Master Cromwell to the workshop of Rovezzano in Westminster. Ah, Signor Rovezzano, what a lovely day, how nice to see you. I've just come from the cardinal. He loves the tomb, not quite sure about the nose. Could you just do something about it? Just tweak it a bit, just tweak it a bit. And then back to his master, Your Grace, it's all sorted, Your Grace, sorted and not. And so that's the job. And he did that from 1524 through to the cardinal's fall. And we have letters from Rovezzano praising Signor Cromwell for what he'd done. But there was another aspect to the job, because around the tomb were those priests praying for the soul. We don't know actually where the tomb would have gone, but there would be 2 colleges of priests praying for the cardinal's soul. One in his old university in Oxford, Cardinal College, Oxford, and another in his birthplace, the town of Ipswich, Cardinal College, Ipswich. Here there would be factories of prayer wherever that Italian tomb would go. Now, these would be huge. If the tomb was going to be better than anything else, so would these colleges. And here there was competition, again, royal competition, not this time from King Henry VII, but from a previous King Henry, Henry VI, who had founded exactly the same pair of colleges. One, a school to create students to go to the university college, and in that case it had been Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. Now, Cardinal College, Ipswich and Cardinal College, Oxford would be the same, only better and bigger. And if any of you have been to King's College, Cambridge, you'll know that's quite a challenge. And it would take lots of money, lots and lots of money to make it work. Even the cardinal's resources would be strained in his various bishoprics. But he was also the Pope's personal representative in England, a man committed to reform in the church. And one way of reforming the church would be to get rid of, dissolve certain superfluous monasteries and devote their lands and estates and revenues to a good cause. What better cause could there be than the 2 colleges, Cardinal College and Ipswich and Oxford? And that was part of Cromwell's job. It was all part of the same legacy package, which would now be the cardinal's memorial in the next world. That's what he did, dissolving monasteries, chatting with Italians. From 1524, hugely important job. He didn't do any other things under the cardinal. He had nothing to do with the cardinal's foreign policy or anything like that. It was just that, and he did that for 6 years, making friends as he dissolved monasteries all over the country. It was a very useful way of networking and getting to know England, mostly lowland England, but that's what he got to know. So there's a story which doesn't look like the conventional Thomas Cromwell, and you'll notice how much of it looks Catholic. We've made him the enemy of Anne Boleyn, the friend of the Lady Mary, the future Bloody Mary. We've made him the man who adored a Cardinal of Rome, the Pope's personal representative in England, Wolsey. Catholic? The curious thing is that if you look at Thomas Cromwell's career under the Cardinal, you realize something else is going on. While he's doing all these busy things, creating great chantry colleges, praying for souls in the Catholic manner for the Cardinal, he's actually quietly promoting something new, the Protestant Reformation. Some of the people employed in administering these dissolved monasteries for his Cardinal College, Oxford, were actually members of that shadowy group of pre-Reformation dissenters, the Lollards. He's employing Lollards to do the Cardinal's work. Among his friends who appear in the early correspondence are many of the future names of the English Protestant Reformation, particularly one Miles Coverdale, whose psalms are still the psalms in the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer and lie behind the psalms of the Episcopal Church of the USA. Those psalms are Coverdale's. And already in the 1520s, before the Reformation had officially happened, Thomas Cromwell's quietly subverting the cardinal's aims and projects for this particular new heretical project. And one of the most extraordinary things, which is a witness to this, is the personnel of that hugely expensive new college in Oxford, Cardinal College, Oxford. Its teaching staff were recruited not from Oxford at all, but from the other place, the other university in England, Cambridge. And they all came across, bright young men, the flower of the academic world in Cambridge. And to everyone's horror, they turned out to be Protestants, heretics. And some of them died as a result, imprisoned in the cardinal's cellars. And what kind of happened? Well, the man who recruited them was Thomas Cromwell. He was using the cardinal's project for this new thing, the Reformation. Once more, this tells me something about this man, Thomas Cromwell. He was not a cynical, secular, opportunist politician, as he is so often portrayed, because you don't do this sort of thing if you're that sort of guy. These are things which are dangerous, which could get you burnt at the stake. And yet, he subverts the cardinal's projects for this new thing, the Reformation, which is going to overturn the religion of Western Europe. That is not the action of a cynical man. All right, yes, there is cynicism in the man. There is opportunism. There is political expediency, of course. But alongside it, this steely idealism, which is something which has been missed so often in the story. Maybe he thought that Wolsey would be the leader in the end of this. Wolsey talked a lot about reform, but things went the other way. Wolsey fell from power, thanks to Anne Boleyn, thanks to the Duke of Norfolk. And now Cromwell was adrift. What would he do? Well, he remained extraordinarily loyal to the cardinal in his downfall. Right up to the time when the cardinal died, he was still being the cardinal's man while actually also quietly entering the king's service, because he could be very useful to the king. The king made it evident that he was going to punish the cardinal by taking his lands away, particularly the colleges. And his great house in London, York Place it was once called, now it was called Whitehall, and it was beside the King's Palace in Westminster. And as it was being built, it was Thomas Cromwell who was doing the surveying, the quantity work, the lawyer's side. Who better to do it for the king as he was confiscating these things? So Thomas Cromwell, quietly as the cardinal faded, both defended him and also became what you might call Secretary of State for Wolsey-related affairs to the king. And when the cardinal died of grief and illness on his way to what might have been execution, now Wolsey's servant became the king's servant to do exactly the same things, to look after all these confiscated estates, but also the tomb, because in rather Henry VIII typical style, the king pinched the cardinal's tomb for himself. He just took all the cardinal-related bits off and said to Benedetto da Rovezzano, still in his workshop in Westminster, right, make it the royal tomb. And so it went on all through the 1530s. You still see the entries in Thomas Cromwell's accounts for his dealings with Rovezzano. That was the heart of his transition into the king's service, to do that. Nice footnote of history, King Henry VIII never got his tomb. It lay in bits all through the Tudor period, ended up in St George's Chapel, Windsor, and was dispersed during the Civil War. Ironically, the beautiful black marble casket in the middle now houses another great figure of history, and some of you may have seen it, because this is the tomb of Admiral Nelson, Lord Nelson, in the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral. It's actually Cardinal Wolsey's casket, which was then Henry VIII. So that's how he got into the king's service, and then, of course, he became much more than the administrator of lands, much more than a negotiator with Italians, because his skills just were so evident. They spread and spread and spread. And the king used him for his new marriage, even though the discreet detestation must have been obvious between Anne and Thomas Cromwell. But the power increased, and now he had 9 years of extraordinary helter-skelter in the king's service, ultimately almost in charge of everything until that final fall. What was he thinking of in those years? What were his motives? I think threefold. One, serving the king. Two, promoting the Reformation. And third, and this has been much neglected, promoting his own dynasty. Let's think about those one by one. Serving the king, one of the things he certainly did under the king was dissolve monasteries. But that's not quite as simple and straightforward as it looks. It's often been said that Thomas Cromwell masterminded the destruction of all English monasteries. Not so. We know, actually, that he recommended not dissolving all monasteries, but actually dissolving some piecemeal, bit by bit, just as the cardinal had done. Remember, the cardinal had destroyed monasteries. The cardinal's not part of the Reformation, but he's a Catholic destroying monasteries. And Thomas Cromwell said, well, let's do it as the cardinal did, and let's also notice there was trouble when the cardinal dissolved monasteries. Let's do it just piecemeal. Let's not press things. And he was overruled. Others among the king's servants said, no, clean sweep. And look what happened. The great explosion of fury in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. Thomas Cromwell had predicted that would happen, and it did. But even after that, as monasteries now went down much faster as a result of the defeat of the pilgrimage, you cannot say that it's entirely a policy of destroying the lot. Because it is quite clear that in 1538, autumn 1538, government policy was to transform the greater monasteries, the great abbeys, into colleges, some which were cathedrals, but some which were just colleges. And colleges means, in the 16th century, collegia, which is just a grouping of priests. These would be clergy gathered together to preach and pray in colleges. What does that remind you of? Cardinal Wolsey. This is simply Wolsey's policies, and that could have been the future. But Henry VIII had too many expenses. And so virtually all these monasteries were in fact simply dissolved, but not all. 2 were left as colleges. They'd been abbeys, now they were colleges, Thornton and Burton-on-Trent. But these were not cathedrals, but 6 were made into cathedrals, and they are still there in England. 6 new cathedrals, which you can say are the policy of Cardinal Wolsey transmitted through Thomas Cromwell. So the peculiar, complex relationship between the king's wishes, Thomas Cromwell's plans, and the memory of Cardinal Wolsey behind it all. Then the Reformation. Well, we've seen Thomas Cromwell quietly subverting or adapting or using Cardinal Wolsey's plans. He was doing the same under the king. The king gave him extraordinary power in the new Church of England, which he'd created, having split with the Pope. He gave him an extraordinary new title because no one could quite define what the new job was. It was running the church for the king. What would that be called? Well, they invented a very awkward phrase, vicegerent in spirituals. And that was Thomas Cromwell's title. Never used before, never used afterwards. It's unique to him. But it gave him vague and enormous powers within the church, which were actually exactly the same vague and enormous powers that Cardinal Wolsey had, but for the king and not the Pope. Same powers, actually often the same bureaucrats running the same machinery as Cardinal Wolsey had used before. But how would he use these powers? Well, he was a man of the Reformation, and he gradually persuaded the king to have an official Bible in English. The first time the Bible had been allowed in English in 1,000 years. Really, no, 500 years. 500 years since the Anglo-Saxon period. There had been a Bible, a Lollard Bible, which had been banned by the church, and England, after that, uniquely had no Bible in its own language. Virtually everywhere else in the late medieval church had access to some Bible, if in France, in French, in German, Low German, in Germany, that sort of thing, but not in England. So this was one of the great goals of the English reformers, to get a Bible in everyone's hands, and Thomas Cromwell achieved it. And he achieved it by using a translation of one of the king's enemies, William Tyndale, a man who'd created this wonderful, beautiful translation in defiance of the church and in defiance of the king who hated him. The king had connived at the death of William Tyndale in Charles V's Low Countries. William Tyndale had died a martyr for the English Bible. But now, in 1538-9, Thomas Cromwell got the king to officially designate a Bible for the English. And it was William Tyndale's Bible. He clearly never told the king. It's exactly the same sort of thing that he'd done with the cardinal. And you can see why, in the end, when he was executed, many of the charges against him were those of heresy. And Henry VIII was right. He was a heretic in Henry's terms. Henry was not a man of the Reformation. His servant was. So that's the second of my three motivating thoughts for this man through his time under the king. Then dynasty, family. Well, it's obvious enough, isn't it? Because the king was disrupting the whole country, ending 1,000 years of relationship with Rome for the sake of dynasty. The king was obsessed by a son. Why would his servants not be? Here was the boy from Putney, now Baron Cromwell of Wimbledon. That name must go on. It would go on in the shape of this boy, Gregory Cromwell, the only surviving child of Thomas Cromwell after his two daughters died in 1528-9. And here you see him in yet another Holbein. Holbein was a bit of a family painter for the Cromwells, and you can recognize him as Thomas Cromwell's son, although he's rather prettier as a teenager than the jowly bureaucrat we've seen. 1537, he's 17, and here is an image which is going to be paired by that of his father, another beautiful little miniature. And the expression here is not really like Holbein's 1532 portrait, is it? It's indulgent, it's affectionate. These two miniatures are a pair, though I've actually not got them at the same size. They are, let me assure you, they are. So these beautiful little affectionate, expensive images. Why 1537? Because the boy was marrying. He was marrying this lady. Lady Uhtred she was already a widow, she was about 19, but she already had 2 kids by her first husband, Sir Anthony Uhtred, and now she would be the wife of Gregory Cromwell. She would go on to be wife to Lady Paulet, to the Marquis of Winchester's son, so Lady Paulet towards the end of her life. But you see her birth name, Seymour. This marriage took place in 1537. And she was the sister of the Queen, Queen Jane Seymour. So the beer brewer's son from Putney has married his son to the king's sister-in-law. And in an informal sense, that made Thomas Cromwell the king's uncle. No wonder he looked pleased. And can you imagine more grinding of teeth from Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk? How much he must have hated that. And if you need any explanation of the fall and death of Thomas Cromwell, it's almost enough to draw attention to this marriage, which would found a dynasty. And what a woman Elizabeth Seymour was. She became an unexpected heroine in my story. I rather took to her. This is yet another Holbein. It's now in Toledo. But what a face. And I think she was a match for her father-in-law. And she saved the dynasty because after Thomas's execution, she wrote personally to the king saying, "Look, I know my father-in-law, dreadful, dreadful things he did, but please take pity on my poor husband and my poor children." She saved them, and the king listened and gave young Gregory a new peerage as another Baron Cromwell. And so the family went on. They survived as the Barons Cromwell up to 1686, with a couple of Irish peerages thrown in. So you really can say that in that sense, Thomas Cromwell was a great success. He really won. So much, then, is new in what I've been able to find. And I could say so much. But I'd rather give you a chance to take the conversation where you want to go. So on the note that the Cromwells will go ahead despite the death of the great patriarch, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Diarmaid. So we now have time for questions. Our experience in this room is that if you shout your question out, you can be heard. So please stand and project your question. If we need to repeat it from the podium, we will. Are there questions? Hi there. Go ahead.
Okay. So the sense that I've gotten of Cromwell, and that may just be because of Hilary Mantel, I don't know, was that he was a cosmopolitan, almost modern man, living in a world surrounded by people who were still pretty much late medieval. Now, does that make any sense at all?
So the Mantel, Thomas Cromwell, looks cosmopolitan in a world of late medieval people. I think there is truth in that. I mean, he is extraordinarily clever and extraordinarily accomplished, and I think that's one of the reasons why so many of the nobility hated him, because they regarded themselves as having the God-given right to rule England. And then this man who comes across who's clearly so much brighter than them. And that must have been infuriating. Of course, Thomas Cromwell did have friends among the nobility, and they're generally as cosmopolitan and cultured and often Italianate as he is. So it's not a class thing exactly. There is snobbery there. The Mantel portrait is interesting because I think if you read Wolf Hall, and I had this experience in reading Wolf Hall, you end up thinking, well, yeah, he's quite a nice guy. He's a bit of what in English terms would be called a Guardian reader. I don't know. Trying to think of the American equivalent. You I think you got it. The New Yorker, yes. But you read Bring Up the Bodies, the next novel, and you see something darker and more angry. And actually, of course, she spotted the hatred of Anne Boleyn and the need for revenge. It's a revenge story, Vol 2. And Vol 3 very satisfyingly opens it up. But that's a truth. It's not the whole truth, but he is an extraordinary intellect. Not a writer, but a man who can systematize. In that sense, Geoffrey Elton's Tudor revolution in government had a sort of sense, but it's more that this man is very tidy. and also a man with a sense of an opportunity, and turning an opportunity into an office or a piece of bureaucracy if necessary, but otherwise, no. But he did tidy. He tidied up Wales. He made Wales part of the English kingdom in a way it had not been. He was beginning to try that in Ireland at the time of his execution. Didn't work, and it's not his fault that the rest of Anglo-Irish relations are so appalling. If his scheme had worked as it did in Wales, then the rest of history could have been very different. So, late medieval men against cosmopolitan men. He is a Renaissance man in a literal sense. He is a man who's in touch with the Italian Renaissance.
Further questions?
That's one now. Would you like to stand? And then, yeah.
In movies and TV, a lot of the time you see that they sort of bring in that he's responsible for Anne Boleyn's fall.
Yeah.
That the orchestrating a lot of charges. Is there any truth to that, or?
Was the $61,000 question. Was Thomas Cromwell responsible for Anne Boleyn's fall? Yes. Completely. Completely. He orchestrated it from January 1536. Historians have often complicated this by saying, oh, it was a Catholic plot which Thomas Cromwell took over. No, it wasn't. He was directly in touch with the Lady Mary from the moment that Queen Anne miscarried her child in January, which was the fatal moment when the king lost his love for her, a sorely tried love anyway. So, yeah, it's entirely his orchestrating of the fact, the absolutely essential fact that the king had fallen out of love with her. And the psychology of Henry VIII is that he will do a complete turnaround, a 180-degree turnaround. If he loves you, he will hate you, and he will need reasons for doing so. So what Thomas Cromwell did was provide the reasons, virtually all of which can be proved to be spurious. She did not commit incest with her own brother. She was not at the places that the indictment said she was when on these supposed adultery occasions. What I think she did was laugh at the king behind his back with fashionable young men at court. And Henry just loathed being laughed at. Absolutely loathed it. And that's as bad as treason. And so that was enough for Thomas Cromwell to work this for the, well, one might say laudable aim of getting Mary in the succession.
Hi there, go ahead.
So was Thomas More a saint or a ruthless torturer?
Was Thomas Cromwell a saint or a ruthless torturer? He was, well, as historians say, a bit of both. Ruthless torturer, we know that he didn't personally torture people. John Fox said so in one of the editions of his great Reformation history, the Book of Martyrs, the Acts and Monuments. He then withdrew that statement. But Thomas More clearly approved of burning people in a big way, In his literary dialogue with, dialogue with William Tyndale, his bitter literary exchange with William Tyndale, he said, "We have not burned enough people in the last decade." So Saint, well, fascinating character, witty man, hero at the end, a man who went to his death with enormous nobility and stood up to the king when virtually no one else did. All that is true. Well, I like my saints complicated, and he's a complicated man. It must be said that Hilary's portrayal of him is not the rounded picture, and she did not intend it to be. She said she was seeing Thomas More through Thomas Cromwell's eyes. And that is what a novelist can do. Historians can't do that. We've got to be more balanced. But she doesn't need to be. And I think her novels have been criticised for their treatment of More unfairly. And it is not a way of understanding what a novel is about.
We'll take one more. Go ahead.
With the importance of these people, did anyone hire bodyguards?
Sorry, just missed that.
Did anyone hire bodyguards with all these intrigues?
Did hire bodyguards? They all had bodyguards. Yeah, you need a big entourage round you at the time. The higher up you get, the more you need. I mean, it's like power anywhere. And Thomas Cromwell had a formidable armoury in his private house in East London. And of course, that's for the king. It is to defend the king, and he showed it proudly to the French ambassador in the late 1530s. But the moment the king turned against Cromwell, then it's a proof of treason. Proof of treason.
On that bleak note, we shall call the occasion to a close. Please join us for coffee and cookies, which are served on this occasion outside the bookstore, because Diarmaid will be available to sign copies of his biography of Thomas Cromwell, provided, of course, that you buy one first.
Well, if you've already bought one.
Well, these things are negotiable. But please join me in thanking Diarmaid MacCulloch for an extraordinary performance.